Willful Virgin. Essays in Feminism by Marilyn Frye. Part 3. Making Worlds of Sense. Essay number 10. Lesbian Sex. 1987. The reasons the word sex is in quotation marks is in my title are two. One is that the term sex is an inappropriate term for what lesbians do, and the other is that whatever it is that lesbians do that, for lack of a better word, might be called sex, we apparently do damned little of it. For a great many lesbians, the gap between the high hopes we had some time ago for lesbian sex and the way things have worked out has turned the phrase lesbian sex into something of a bitter joke. I don't want to exaggerate. Many lesbians are having gratifying erotic lives. But in our community as a whole, there is much grumbling about quote-unquote lesbian bed death, especially in long-term relationships. I want to explore the meanings of the relative dearth of what, for lack of a better word, we call lesbian sex. These meanings connect in interesting ways with other aspects of the feminist discussion of what, for lack of a better word, we call quote-unquote sexuality and quote-unquote sexuality is very clearly significant in the webs of meaning and force which keep patriarchy going. Recent discussions of lesbian, quote-unquote, sex frequently cite the findings of a study on couples by Bloomstein and Schwartz, which is perceived by most of those who discuss it as having been done well with a good sample of couples: lesbian, male homosexual, heterosexual non-married, and heterosexual married couples. These people apparently found that lesbian couples, quote-unquote, have sex far less frequently than any other type of couple, that lesbian couples are less, quote-unquote, sexual as couples and as individuals than anyone else. In their sample, only about 1/3 of lesbians in relationships of 2 years or longer, quote-unquote, had sex once a week or more. 47% of lesbians in long-term relationships, quote-unquote, had sex once a month or less, while among heterosexual married couples, only 15% had sex once a month or less. And they reported that lesbians seem to be more limited in the range of their quote-unquote sexual techniques than are other couples. When this sort of information first came into my circle of lesbian friends, we tended to see it as conforming to what we knew from our own experiences. We were not surprised to hear that we had less sex than anyone else, or that in our long-term relationships we, quote-unquote, had sex a great deal less frequently than other sorts of couples. This seemed to pretty much fit our knowledge of ourselves and of each other. But on more reflection, and looking again at what has been going on with us in our long-term relationships, the nice fit between this report and our experience seemed not so perfect after all. It was brought to our attention during the ruminations on this that what 85% of long-term heterosexual married couples do more than once a month takes on average 8 minutes to do. Although in my experience, lesbians discuss their quote-unquote sex lives with each other relatively little, a point to which I will return, I know from my own experience and from the reports of a few other lesbians in long-term relationships that what we do, on average, we do considerably less frequently, takes on average considerably more than 8 minutes to do. Maybe about 30 minutes at least. Sometimes maybe about an hour. And it is not uncommon that among these relatively uncommon occurrences, an entire afternoon or evening is given over to activities organized around doing it. The suspicion arises that what 85% of heterosexual married couples are doing more than once a month and what 47% of lesbian couples are doing less than once a month is not the same thing. And if they are not doing the same thing, how is this research done that would line these different things up against each other to compare how many times they were done? I remember that one of my first delicious tastes of old gay lesbian culture occurred in a bar where I was chatting with some other lesbians I was just getting acquainted with. One was talking about being busted out of the Marines for being gay. She had been put under suspicion somehow and was sent off to the base psychiatrist to be questioned, her perverted tendencies to be assessed. He wanted to convince her she had only been engaged in a little youthful experimentation and wasn't really gay. To this end, he questioned her about the extent of her experience. What he asked was, quote, "How many times have you had sex with a woman?" End quote. At this, we all laughed and giggled. What an ignorant fool he was. What does he think he means by quote unquote times? What will we count? What's to count? Another of my friends, years later, discussing the same conundrum, said that she thought maybe every time you got up to go to the bathroom, that marked a time. The joke about quote unquote how many times is still good for a chuckle from time to time in my life with my lover. I have no memory of any such topic providing any such merriment in my years of sexual encounters and relationships with men. It would have been very rare indeed that we would not have known how to answer the question, quote unquote, how many times did you do it? If what heterosexual married couples do that the individuals report under the rubric sex or have sex is something that in most instances can easily be individuated into countable instances, this is more evidence that it is not what long term lesbian couples do, or, for that matter, what short term lesbian couples do. What violence did the lesbian do to their experience by answering the same question the heterosexuals answered, as though it had the same meaning for them? How did the lesbians figure out how to answer the question, quote unquote, how frequently, or quote unquote, how many times? My guess is, for starters, that different individuals figured it out differently to some degree. Some might have counted a 2 or 3 cycle evening as quote unquote one time they had sex. Some might have counted that as 2 or 3 times. Some may have counted as times only the times both partners had orgasms. Some may have counted as times occasions on which at least one had an orgasm. Some may not have orgasm, or have rarely or may not have figured out orgasms into the calculation. Perhaps they counted as a time every episode in which both touched the other's vulva more than fleetingly and not for something like a health examination. For some, to count every reciprocal touch of the vulva would have made them count as quote unquote having sex more than most people with work to do would dream of having time for. How do we suppose those individuals counted times? Is there any good reason why they should not count all those times? Does it depend on how fulfilling it was? Was anybody else counting by occasions of fulfillment? We have no idea how individual lesbians individuated their so called quote unquote sexual acts or encounters. We have no idea what it means when they said they did it less than once a month. But this raises questions for how the heterosexual individuated and counted their sexual acts or encounters. I think many lesbians, when pressed to answer a question like, quote unquote, how many times a month do you have sex, count times both partners had orgasms. That seems to them definitive enough. Did the heterosexuals who responded to these questions count only the times both parties had orgasms? Did the men count all the times they had orgasms and the women count all the times they had orgasms? If so, one would expect the authors of the study to have noted a considerable difference between the reports of the women and of the men in the sample of heterosexual couples. In my experience, and by my reading of the predominant culture generally, heterosexual pairs count as having had sex whether the woman had an orgasm or not. And in my experience, and by my reading of the culture at large, heterosexual pairs might not count themselves as having had sex if that was done with the man digitally stimulating a woman's clitoris until she had an orgasm. I think that if the heterosexual woman counted quote unquote times, according to the standard meaning of quote unquote have sex in English, they counted not according to their own experience of orgasm or even arousal, but according to their partner's orgasms and ejaculations. One wonders how heterosexual women would have individuated and counted the incidents of quote unquote having sex in their relationships if they had not counted according to their partner's orgasms and ejaculations, or how they did count times if they did not count them this way. If the having of sex by heterosexual married couples did take on the average 8 minutes, my guess is that in a large number of those cases, the women did not experience orgasms. My guess is that neither the woman's pleasure nor the woman's orgasms were pertinent in most of the individuals counting and reporting the frequency with which they, quote unquote, had sex. So, do lesbian couples really have sex any less frequently than heterosexual couples? My own view is that lesbian couples, quote unquote, have sex a great deal less frequently than heterosexual couples. I think, in fact, we don't have sex at all. By the criteria I'm betting most of the heterosexual people used in reporting the frequency with which they have sex, lesbians don't have sex. There is no male partner whose orgasm and ejaculation can be the criterion for counting quote unquote times. I'm willing to draw the conclusion that heterosexual women don't have sex either, that what they report is the frequency with which their partners had sex. It has been said before by feminists that the concept of quote unquote having sex is a phallic concept, that it pertains to heterosexual intercourse, in fact, primarily to heterosexist intercourse, that is, male dominant, female subordinate copulation whose completion and purpose is the male ejaculation. I have thought this was true since the very first time the idea was put on me, some 12 years ago. But I have been finding lately that I have to go back over some of the ground I covered a decade ago, because some of what I knew then, I knew too superficially. For some of us, myself included, the move from heterosexual relating to lesbian relating was occasioned or speeded up or brought to closure by a recognition that what we had done under the heading of quote unquote having sex had indeed been male dominant, female subordinate copulation whose completion and purpose is the male ejaculation, and it was not worthy of doing. Yet now, years later, we are willing to answer questionnaires that ask us how frequently we quote unquote have sex and are dissatisfied with ourselves and with our relationships because we don't quote unquote have sex enough. We are so dissatisfied that we keep a small army of therapists in business trying to help us quote unquote have sex more. We quit having sex years ago, and for excellent and compelling reasons. What exactly is our complaint now? In all these years I've been doing and writing feminist theory, I have not until very recently written, much less published, a word about sex. I did not write, though it was suggested to me that I do so, anything in the S&M debates. I left entirely unanswered an invitation to be the keynote speaker at a feminist conference about women's sexuality, which by all reports turned out to be an excellent conference. I was quite unable to think of anything but vague truisms to say, and very few of those. Feminist theory is grounded in experience. I have always written feminist political and philosophical analysis from the bottom up, starting with my own encounters and adventures, frustrations, pain, anger, etc. Sometimes it has ended up, no doubt partly because of this, a little provincial, but it has at least the virtue of firm connection with someone's real life experience, which is more than you can say for a lot of philosophy, including a lot of feminist theory. When I put to myself the task of theorizing about sex and sexuality, it was as though I had no experience, as though there was no ground on which and from which to generate theory. But if I understand the terminology right, I have in fact been what they call quote unquote sexually active for close to a quarter of a century, about half my life, almost all of what they call one's quote unquote adult life, heterosexually, lesbianly, and quote unquote autoerotically. Surely I have experience, but I seem not to have experiential knowledge of the sort I need. Reflecting on all of this history, I realize that in many of its passages, this experience has been a muddle. Acting, being acted on, choosing, desiring, pleasure, and displeasure all akimbo, not coherently determining each other. Even in its greatest intensity, it has for the most part been somehow rather opaque to me, not fully in my grasp. My quote unquote experience has in general the character more of a buzzing, blooming confusion than of experience. And it has occurred in the midst of almost total silence on the part of others about their experience. The experience of others has, for the most part, also been opaque to me. They do not discuss or describe it in detail at all. I recall an hours-long and heated argument about some 8 or 10 lesbians at a party a couple of years ago about S&M, whether it is okay or not. When Carolyn and I left, she noted that in the whole time not one woman had said one concrete, explicit, physiologically specific thing about what she actually did. The one arguing in favor of bondage. Did she have her hands tied gently with ribbons or scarves, or harshly with handcuffs or chains? What other parts of her body were or weren't restrained, and by what means? And what parts of her body touched, and how, while she was bound? And what liberty did she still have to touch in return? And if she had no such liberty, was it part of her experience to want that liberty and experience tension or frustration? Or was it her experience that she felt pleased or satisfied not having that liberty? Who knows? She never said a single word at this level of specificity, nor did anyone else, pro or con. I once perused a large and extensively illustrated book on sexual activity by and for homosexual men. It was astounding to me for one thing in particular, namely, that its pages constituted a huge lexicon of specific vocabulary, words for acts and activities, their sub-acts, preludes and denouement, their stylistic variations, their sequences. Gay male sex, I realized then, is articulate. It is articulate to a degree that, in my world, lesbian sex has not remotely approached. Lesbian quote-unquote sex, as I have known it most of the time I have known it, is utterly inarticulate. Most of my lifetime, most of my experience in the realms commonly designated as quote-unquote sexual has been pre-linguistic, non-cognitive. I have, in effect, no linguistic community, no language, and therefore, in one important sense, no knowledge. In situations of male dominance, women are quote-unquote muted group a muted group, inasmuch as women are, for the most part, excluded from the formulation and validation of meaning and thereby denied the means to express themselves. Men's meanings, and no women's meanings, are encoded in what is presumed to be the whole population's language. In many cases, both the men and the women assume it is everyone's language. The meanings one's life and experience can generate cannot come fully into operation without being encoded. They are fleeting, or they hover, vague, not fully coalesced, not useful for explaining or grounding interpretations, desires, complaints, theories. In response to our understanding that there is something going on in patriarchy that is more or less well described by saying women's meanings are not encoded in the dominant language, and that this keeps our experience from being fully formed and articulate, we have undertaken quite deliberately to discover, complete, and encode our meanings. Such simple things as naming chivalrous gestures, quote-unquote insulting, naming Virginia Woolf a great writer, naming ourselves women instead of girls or ladies, coining terms like sexism, sexual harassment, incester. Mary Daly's Wikidary is a whole project of quote-unquote encoding meanings, and we can all find examples of our own local encodings. Meanings should arise from our bodily self-knowledge, bodily play, tactile communication, the ebb and flow of intense excitement, arousal, tension, release, comfort, discomfort, pain, and pleasure. And I make no distinction here among bodily, emotional, intellectual, and aesthetic. But such meanings are more completely muted, less coalesced into discrete elements of the coherent pattern of meanings, of an experience, than any other dimensions of our lives. In fact, there are for many of us virtually no meanings in this realm because nothing of it is crystallized in a linguistic matrix. What we have for generic words to cover this terrain are the words sex, sexual, and sexuality. In our efforts to liberate ourselves from the stifling, woman-hating Victorian denial that women even have bodily awareness, arousal, excitement, orgasms, and so on, many of us actively took these words for ourselves and claimed that we do, quote-unquote, do sex, and we are sexual, and we have sexuality. This has been particularly important to lesbians because the very fact of sex being a phallocentric term has made it especially difficult to get across the idea that lesbians are not, for lack of a penis between us, as Alex Dobkin put it in a song lyric, making do with feeble and partial and pathetic half-satisfactions. Asserting the robustness and unladylikeness of our passions and actions, some of us have called some of what we do, quote unquote, fucking. But it seems to me that the attempt to encode our lustiness and lustfulness, our passion and our vigorous carnality in the words sex, sexual, and sexuality has backfired. Instead of losing their phallocentricity, these words have imported the phallocentric meaning into and onto experience in which is not in any way phallocentric. A web of meanings which maps emotional intensity, excitement, arousal, bodily play, orgasm, passion, and relational adventure back onto a semantic center in a male dominant, female subordinate copulation whose completion and purpose is the male ejaculation, has been so utterly inadequate as to have us speechless, meaningless, and ironically, according to the Blumstein and Swartz report, quote unquote, not as sexual, as couples, or as individuals as any other group. Our lives, the character of our embodiment, cannot be mapped back onto this semantic center. What we try to synthesize and articulate is by the rules of that mapping. We end up trying to mold our loving and passionate carnal intercourse into explosive 8-minute events. But that is the timing and the ontology of an alienated and patriarchal penis, not of the lesbian body. When the only thing that counts as quote unquote doing it are those passages of our interactions which most closely approximate a paradigm that arose from the meanings of the rising and falling penis. No wonder we discover ourselves to quote unquote do it rather less often than do pairs with one or more penises present. Interpreting our desires and determining our acts by the rules of that semantic map, we have tended to discount, discontinue, never try, or never even imagine acts, activities, practices, rituals, forms of plays, ways of touching, looking, talking, which might be woven into the fabric of our erotic experience. There are many cultural and social psychological reasons why women, in white Euro-American groups, but also in many other configurations and realizations of patriarchy, would generally be somewhat less clear and less assertive about their desires and about getting their satisfactions than men would generally be. And when we pair up two women in a couple, it stands to reason that those reasons would double up and tend to affect relationships in which there is a lowish frequency of clearly delineated desires and direct initiations of satisfactions. But for all the help it might be to lesbian bodies to work past the psychological and behavioral habits of femininity that inhibit our passion and pleasure, my suggestion is that we have never taken seriously enough is the language which mutes our meanings. My positive recommendation is this. Instead of starting with a point in the life of a body unlike our own, and trying to make meanings along vectors from that point, we would do better to start with a wide field of our passions and bodily pleasures and make meanings that weave a web across it. I suggest that we begin the creation of a vocabulary that can encode and expand our meanings by adopting a very wide and general concept of quote unquote doing it. Let it be an open, generous, commodious concept encompassing all the acts and activities by which we generate with each other the thrills, tenderness, and ecstasy, passages of passionate carnality of whatever duration or profundity. Everything from vanilla to licorice, from poos to tangerine, from velvet to ice, from cuddles to cunts, from chortles to tears. Starting from there, we can let our experiences generate a fine-tuned, descriptive vocabulary that maps and expresses the differences and distinctions among the things we do, the kinds of pleasures we get, the stages and styles of our acts and activities, the parts of our bodies centrally engaged in the different kinds of quote-unquote doing it, and so on. Our vocabulary will arise among us as we explain and explore and define our pleasures and our preferences across this field, teaching each other what the possibilities are and how to make them real. The vocabulary will arise among us, of course, only if we talk with each other about what we're doing and why, and what it feels like. Language is social. So is quote unquote doing it. I'm hoping it will be a lot easier to talk about what we do and how and when and why, concretely and in detail, once we've learned to laugh at foolish studies that show lesbians don't have sex as often as, aren't as sexual as, and use fewer sexual techniques than other folks.